I'm Imad Khan, founder and CEO of Mercury, and today we've got a remote episode of Series T with Andrew Ofstad, the co-founder and chief product officer of Airtable. Prior to Airtable, Andrew led the redesign of Google Maps and was a PM for Android. He co-founded Airtable in 2012 and they have since raised over 170 million from investors including Benchmark, Thrive Capital, and CRV. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Imad. Happy to join.
So you're the product officer. I guess we wanted to kind of dive into kind of the journey of getting the product to market initially. So you started in 2012. Give us a quick timeline of what it took to get Airtable live.
Yeah, sure. So started in 2012 with my co-founder Howie, who's our CEO. Initially just the two of us, and then our third co-founder Emma joined shortly after. But early days were just, I think we really kind of tried to set a solid foundation. We kind of to be honest, took our time learning about the space. Did a lot of reading of from a lot of the early computing pioneers like Alan Kay, Doug Engelbart, and even before we kind of started working with the company, tried to really just do our research into the prior art in the space. We both left our respective companies about the same time. I was at Google, as you mentioned, and Howie had started a YC company, eTax, that was bought by Salesforce. And at Salesforce, he saw that a lot of software out there, at least useful business software, is more or less just a database with some CRUD actions and views and kind of workflow on top of it. So so I think we were just really inspired by the problem of how do you take this thing that we do as programmers, which is create useful software and enable anybody to do that.
Well, three of you programmers.
Yeah, so we were all engineers. We actually knew each other in college, and so we used to kind of work on hack projects together and sort of talk about tech and that type of stuff a lot. Yeah, so we were just really inspired by that problem, and ended up leaving our respective companies to work on Airtable at the same time.
When you say you did some research where you looked at these early tech pioneers, that's a bit. I mean, I've talked to lots of entrepreneurs. I haven't heard that before. What was that process? Was it useful? Was it okay, this is how they did it, and this is what we should do based on that, or was it just kind of purely background info?
I think it was useful in the sense that it sort of, in some ways, kind of validated what we're working on. I think it's a lot of the best ideas out there have been around for a while. The time hasn't really been right, or sort of the execution hasn't quite been right. And I think we saw a bunch of these old products like HyperCard and old database products that were kind of end user focused, and even things like the creation of the original GUI operating system, and kind of moving from a command line interface to something that was much more accessible to a broader audience. I think it just kind of showed that this was something that is possible. And I think it's more inspiration and something that kind of kept us going too. And just, we love that type of HCI work and sort of the types of problems they were solving. So I would say it was part useful, kind of part to know about, and part just inspiration, something that made us excited to kind of get up every day and work on this problem and try to. There were practical things too, just sort of the way that they invented the initial GUI operating system and sort of the early days of Mac, and was a lot of just kind of prototyping and coming up with these metaphors and testing out with users, and kind of the next day rinse and repeating and making a bunch of changes and then testing it with users. So very much took that approach in the early days of Airtable, which was just create a lot of prototypes, create a very kind of early demo, and then just try it and show it to people and get feedback and iterate quickly. So I think there was some practical advice from those readings, and as well as just something we got super excited about and was inspirational for us.
How long were you doing prototype, test with users, etc., versus let's build the whole thing? And was the idea you were prototyping one feature at a time and testing it, or were you prototyping a whole thing and testing it?
We're basically building a full thing. So it was basically a complete front end only product, and we just built the whole thing in our own kind of JavaScript framework on the web, in the browser, and we didn't actually build the back end, so it would work really well. You could do everything, and it would persist to local store in the browser. And so you could actually use it for real use cases. And we kind of started to use it on our own computers, but it wasn't collaborative. It didn't, have a backend persistence or anything. So we just kind of took the approach of let's build a product and the fastest way to sort of, prove out the sort of interaction paradigms and sort of the design and the main problem, which was simplifying this very complex thing of a database and how do you like make that, what's the design to make that accessible to an end user? So kind of like just building out like this spreadsheet interface and like this very simple table metaphor that people could really easily interact with and understand was sort of the first thing we needed to de-risk. And so we worked just on that in like the easiest way possible and didn't worry about like sort of scaling it up.
Only after you worry that like that was like too focused on the single player, single session use case, or you thought that was like if you nailed that, that was like extensible to the whole problem?
We definitely like were building the prototype with collaboration in mind. And I think pretty early on, we actually kind of built out a simple collaborative layer where I think it still like did something hacky where it kind of like, shared data through local store or something like that. And there wasn't like backend persistence, but it still like allowed you to sort of like simulate the collaborative aspects of it. But I think, we sort of from the start, we knew the collaboration aspect was important and sort of wanted it to be fully real time. Pretty early on, we kind of did start building out the persistence layer so we could actually start using it for real use cases. So maybe after like 6 months or so of just kind of like a purely front end prototype, we kind of started building out the server side. And then like at that point, we got like an initial customer or like friends kind of trying it early on who were using the product and sort of validating parts of it and giving us feedback. So I think it was like, over the course of the year or maybe even like a year and a half before we sort of had like a real alpha product where people besides just like a few of our friends and ourselves could actually sign up for it. But it was definitely just early days, just kind of like proving out the design of the product and just really focusing on that.
How quickly from like you quitting your jobs did you have like something to show people? Like, was it like a few months later, or was it like you quit your job and like a few weeks later you're showing like people prototypes and like playing with them?
I think it was like we quit our jobs and we probably within a couple of weeks we had like a very early prototype, and I think it was probably about 3 or 4 months later that we kind of started showing it to investors and pitching the product. And I think like even probably a year before that, I think while we were both kind of working our full-time jobs, I think Howie especially kind of had the broader idea and the vision for the company and sort of. I was very excited about this idea of kind of making software creation more accessible. So I think the sort of like pre-thinking about the market and the opportunity had happened well before that as well. So I think we sort of had like the broader vision in our minds and like if you look back, our series our series C pitch deck was very similar to what our vision is today, and I think we kind of had like this long kind of lead up to that, and then we built a demo around that to kind of validate that we could. Build a good product and sort of execute transition in the space. And so, I think it was, over the course of a couple of weeks, that we kind of built out the initial demo.
One thing that's always tricky is like when you're building these like big visions and big products, it's hard to get like user feedback early on. So I wonder how, like, do you think it was critical getting in front of people, showing it, like iterating like that, rather than just kind of staying in your offices and doing it like just by yourself? And I think.
Yeah, I think that was useful. I think the initial, kind of before we even showed it to people, it was built on some first principles, just, having a very clean metaphor that people can understand, doing things like kind of co-opting the spreadsheet interface, and then just ourselves spending a long time iterating on just kind of trying to make the building blocks of Airtable as simple as possible. Things like views, like how do you do a query, kind of we have like this idea of like a view switcher, and it's a pretty simple model for that. And so I think like we tried to make it as simple as possible from first principles, and then like started getting validation shortly after that. But spent a lot of time just like with ourselves, just kind of iterating on it and kind of seeing what felt right and seeing how like all the pieces fit together. And then sort of like there was some early feedback that we got from initial friends and family and early customers.
Did you ever think that like this comes up with Mercury sometimes? I'm sure it came up a lot with Airtable, where it's like, rather than going like really broad and like this is like a full, you guys were like, this is a full database spreadsheet hybrid that you can make like any app in. Did you think about like going like very kind of thin and like attacking a vertical, like we're going to attack CRM or we're going to attack like personal kind of task managers or something like that? Or like you were like, hey, we're never going to do the vertical thing. Let's go broad from day zero.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, a lot of investors sort of gave us that advice and said like, hey, you should start with a very narrow use case. And that's kind of the approach that a company like Salesforce took, where, Salesforce started with the sales CRM market. And, but the productforce.com is more or less like a completely generalizable database. So I think we were pretty committed early on to building a horizontal product. And I think there are definitely some trade-offs there. Like it's harder to market. It's harder to say like, here's our customer, we're building just for them. And so like things like how do you prioritize features, that becomes a lot harder. But I think like end of the day, we sort of thought that if we build a sort of a pretty niche product and we start going down that path, it's gonna, we're gonna build for that customer, and it'll probably come at the cost of like the broader horizontal opportunity. And so I think we were always committed to that broader vision of this being a kind of generalizable horizontal product. And I think those types of products are a lot harder to build, but it also means you usually have like less competition. Like it's a kind of just like a huge undertaking to build something like that. So I think just the number of companies that are kind of willing to tackle that and kind of build a product before they kind of start seeing business results are a lot less than if you're kind of tackling a niche market. And I think like once you sort of crack it, the potential market is so huge, and there's like a much higher ceiling to sort of like the audience you could potentially tackle. So we definitely were committed to starting with like that horizontal product. But I do think like pretty early on, we started to kind of see little use cases where we're getting more traction, and it would sort of like tailor our roadmap to that. So, you see a lot of people using it for project management of one sort or another, or tracking things with dates, right? So like, okay, let's build a calendar view, in a Kanban board versus like a map view for like geolocation services. So we definitely kind of like laid a pretty wide net, but then started to see like emergent use cases pop up that we started to double down on from like just a prioritization standpoint and a kind of marketing standpoint. But we're pretty committed to kind of building this horizontal product from the start, and I think it definitely has its trade-offs.
One thing that was like interesting about watching the Airtable journey, and I've known Howie before he started this. Like I feel like there was this idea, you guys worked on it like basically like by yourself in a small group of you for a year and a half, and then I guess around 2013 or something you did like a wider launch, and then it was in relative like I don't want to say obscurity, but like it wasn't like a really well-known brand, and then suddenly in 2017 it felt like it just like that, at least that's my perception of it. Maybe you have a slightly different perception, but it felt like suddenly it was like, oh, everyone was using Airtable, and then since then it's like become this like almost household like brand when it comes to like no code. Like what was it like on the inside? Was it that kind of progression where it suddenly blew up, or was it like you could always see it like some path and it was just like the world just caught on eventually?
Yeah, I think it was a bit of both, to be honest. Like I think we would constantly get points of validation along the way. So, like we built our initial demo, we kind of got a very early alpha out. We see like one customer, this nonprofit, start using it. They're tracking all their students, like all their donations, like, basically their whole business in Airtable. So we say like, and they were just like loving the product, and they're still pretty raw at that point. So you sort of get that initial customer validation of like a few customers that really love the product. And that's kind of maybe one milestone for us. And then like, we just kind of keep adding on to the product. And I think we knew from the start that like the MVP for this thing was like a pretty high bar. Like, you're to some extent competing against spreadsheets that have been around for 30 years, and they're incredibly feature rich. So I think just as we kind of added on more views and field types and just, product functionality, it just kind of opened up more and more use cases. And we just kind of realized it would take a long time to kind of get a real MVP out there. So, maybe 2 or 3 years in, we kind of like start to see a bunch of different customers in different industries. And then, maybe in like 2016, you kind of see your first enterprise customer, you see the viral mechanics of the product do work, and you see it spreading from team to team. So it's really kind of like this breadcrumb trail of like validation along the way. And early on in the product, and I think we do have like these viral mechanics, the sort of exponential growth curve is very flat and spiky, and we have like a press event that spikes up and is flat for a long time. But like, the actual metrics may not have looked that great, but we still had like customer stories and kind of anecdotal evidence of people getting a ton of value out of the product. And then like suddenly it starts growing in companies, and I think the kind of word of mouth reality picks up, and it just kind of hits that inflection point. But it was definitely like a very slow build. And I think the thing that saw us through is just kind of seeing, both the inspirational ways that people are using the product and just loving the product and what we're building ourselves. So I think without those two things, it would have been very hard, just purely based on traction, for us to continue working the product.
Was retention like a key metric for you? Is that the thing that you focused on in the initial phase?
Before we actually were charging for the product, I think that was a good indicator. Like if people are using the product and retaining, even if they're just using it like once a month or once a day, like depending on the use case, if they keep coming back to it, I think that's really important. I think we also just like weighed pretty heavily on just anecdotal feedback, and people saying like, hey, this is amazing. It's like unlocked all this value for us. And then once we started charging for the product and we added kind of our pro plans on, like I think, people vote with their wallets. So that was like the biggest indicator of people's actual value out of it. And I think that was our main metric for a while. And so I think it kind of shifted over time. But as you mentioned, the sort of retention was very important. And it is a very sticky product. Like I think the challenge is you have to take Airtable, this set of building blocks, and fit it to your use case. So there is kind of like this cerebral aspect of you have to like figure out the product and you have to be able to configure it for whatever you're trying to do with it. And that kind of sometimes takes a while to get over. But like once you're over that hump, we found that people retained the product really well and became huge evangelists because it unlocked this incredible power for them that we have as software creators, which is they can suddenly create the perfect application for their team.
Was there a trick to get over that onboarding and education hump? You know how like Superhuman has this like whole like let's do a phone call to get you to inbox zero. Like, do you have like a trick or maybe just like a product move that you did that like really gets people over that kind of education hump?
Yeah, I think for us the templates have been pretty important, and less so like people don't use the templates verbatim, but they're a good way to sort of see the sort of like what you could create or inspire you to kind of see what you can use the product for. So I think we really doubled down on templates, and but also like a lot of things we did just kind of make it feel like something more than a spreadsheet, which it definitely is. Like things like having attachment fields and colored select values and things like calendar views and kind of making it feel more like a rich application versus like a kind of a text and numbers spreadsheet. But I think like there's no silver bullet. I think it's some people are tinkers and they figure it out pretty well and are willing to experiment, and some people are not. And so I think we've tried to double down the people who do figure it out, and then once they do figure it out, they add a bunch of other collaborators, and it sort of expands, and they're kind of like these viral super nodes. So I think kind of finding more of those creators is important as well.
When you were thinking about kind of introducing the pro account, like how did you kind of think about it? How did you price it?
Pretty early on, when we first launched the product, we did have a pricing page, and we just more or less like, we did think the product was like a very premium product and kind of framed more along like a product like Salesforce versus like a productivity tool like Google Docs or Quip. And so we chose a price point we thought made sense with that kind of premium framing. So we ended up kind of landing on $24 per user per month for the pro plan. Like honestly, we weren't super scientific about it. We were just like, yeah, let's kind of start here and we can always like go down, but this is a good starting point. So we chose that. And then honestly, like we just kind of started putting any new feature we built only into the pro plan with the rationale that like if we want to move it into a lower end plan, like the plus, so we have like a free plan, a plus plan, and a pro plan. And we just kind of like put everything in the pro plan. And then like with the rationale, it's easier to like move things to a lower end plan than it is to sort of like take it away from the lower plan, paid plan and move it up. So we just kind of like started putting all new features we built into the highest level plan. And then like we already had like a bunch of customers who had put their credit cards in because we basically accepted Stripe. We had like this kind of fake pricing page. People could upgrade and put their credit card in, but we hadn't actually built a billing system to start billing them. Okay. So we had some like early validation that people were like putting their cards in. We just like weren't charging them. So then like 6 months in, we just kind of like finally built out our billing system and started charging them and started like gating more and more features and, kind of started enforcing some of our usage limits and, just kind of started to see the revenue start to kind of track with our user growth. But it was just a progression of adding in more and more features to that pro plan over time. And, at that point we felt that what we had in our free plan was like a pretty good set of things that could sort of prove the value of the product and get people to fully build something out for the use case. And then the sort of more advanced features in the pro plan, were unlocks for larger team scenarios and advanced functionality, but they weren't things that prevented you from understanding the power of the product in that sort of free trial period.
So it wasn't like things that you consider, let's say, network effects or something. It's not, you didn't try to push those into the free plan, like, potentially like make it limited features, but like very broad spread kind of thing. That wasn't like thinking behind it?
No, well, we're pretty hesitant to do things like make it free until you've added 5 people or something like that, just because then you have this incentive where people don't want to add collaborators and spread the product, and we're always sure to have things like shared views where you can sort of like send a link to somebody with a view or embed a view on your page. make sure those are part of the free plan, just so since those are sort of like have these positive externalities of virality. So I think the premium features we did add were things like advanced calendar and functionality, and now more and more sort of like permissions features that prevent people from doing certain things. So yes, to your point, it's definitely I think the free plan has all the features that allow people to sort of use the product in a viral way.
What do you think of the now there's this whole like no code movement? Airtable's part of it. I mean, I guess like there's been waves of no code movements in the history of computing. What do you think of this wave? Do you I guess like just broadly, like was this a trend that you were predicting? Or
it's not something we predicted. I think it kind of makes sense given just how much digital transformation is happening at companies and how powerful software is and how it enables people to come together and do great work as a team within companies. And I think it's impossible for either for other companies to create the perfect like vertical software for every single use case, given that every company does things differently. And each team, has a kind of a different way they do things, and you can't sort of have a one size fits all solution for every different use case out there. And on the other hand, you can't have, everybody can't have their own developer or like their own internal development team that's kind of building software with code. So I think it just kind of makes sense that we have to figure out a new way for people to create software without having to learn this very arcane thing, which is like writing code. Looking back, it does seem like it's inevitable, and I think it's really exciting that there's like a whole ecosystem of these tools now, and companies like Zapier, and there's a lot of cool stuff out there like StandardLib and Retool, and I think it's kind of both validating for us to see that people are kind of catching on to the size of this market, and to see like this kind of creative wellspring of other companies popping up around the space and sort of empowering people to build software without writing code.
What's the best fundraising advice you've ever received?
Raise more money than you need, I would say.
How much more?
Just raise as much as possible. I don't know.
Like how much more money? Like an extra 30%? Runway? Like what's
30%. I would, maybe just make sure you have at least 2.5 years, I guess.
Oh, really?
Something I'd be comfortable with, but
well, especially in the current world. What startup idea do you wish someone would implement right now?
I'm kind of missing with remote work just a good whiteboarding experience, especially with like interviews and just like brainstorming. Zoom has like this crappy little whiteboard thing where you can sort of like invite somebody to some other tool, something that combines like video plus like free-form creative brainstorming in some way would be really powerful. So
it would be kind of cool, and I thought of a good way of doing it. It's just like you can't with the mouse, you can't really whiteboard, but if you had like an iPad companion that was connected to the Zoom thing as well, like I feel like there's an answer there where like you can whiteboard much better on like a touch screen.
Yeah, exactly. And if there's just kind of like a collaborative, if each person just had an iPad and can sort of like easily just sketch things out, that'd be pretty ideal.
All right, Andrew, it's been awesome having you. I think this
cool.
Lots of interesting insight, especially for kind of product-minded founders. Anything else you wanted to leave us with?
No, I think that's it. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, and let me know if I can help in another way.
Oh yeah, you got to show the tea to the audience there. It's probably gone cold now. I think you've just...
No, I've been drinking it a little bit. Yeah, it's good.